Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Truth About Leadership, the No Fads, Heart of the Matter Facts You Need to Know. My name is Sarah Blanchette, and I am the Corporate Marketing Manager for EBSCO Information Services. I will be moderating the session today. I'd like to start off by introducing our presenter, Jim Kouzes. Jim is the co-author of over a dozen books, including the award-winning and best-selling book, The Leadership Challenge, with over 2.5 million copies sold. As an expert in leadership, Jim has received accolades from the Wall Street Journal, the Association for Talent Development, HR Magazine, and Trust Across America. Before Jim begins the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is scheduled for 1 hour. We will pause throughout the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation by entering them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you in the coming days. Please be advised that we have muted all audio lines to avoid feedback or interruption during the presentation. Again, please use the chat box to communicate with the presenters and myself regarding any questions that you have during the session. Without further delay, I would like to hand things over to Jim to get us started.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate that gracious introduction, and welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to The Truth About Leadership, and thank you to your colleague Tad, Sarah, and to EBSCO for this opportunity to present to our colleagues, leaders and HR developers and others interested in leadership and leadership development. Now, Barry Posner and I have been working on leadership, as Sarah indicated, for now over 3 decades. And during that time, we noticed that there were a few patterns that kept repeating themselves in terms of what made leaders exemplary. Beyond the practices that we had already written about, there were a certain set of principles that kept reappearing. And I was on a panel, and I was presenting on that panel to a group of HR folks, and I came to a point where I was uncertain about what I was going to say in response to a question, and I said, I don't know what you call something that's been the same for 25 years, but, and before I could finish my sentence, Ken Blanchard interrupted and said, I'd call it the truth. And you know, Ken was absolutely right. There are some fundamentals that have been consistent throughout the 4 decades that Barry Posner and I have been researching leadership, and the over 3 decades that we've been writing about it. And I would like to share a few of those with you today. My agenda is to discuss 5 leadership truths that have survived the test of time and offer you, for each of those, one thing that you can take away and apply to use those truths in your context. So let's begin with the first one. We asked the question in our research, what do you look for and admire in a leader? Someone whose direction you would willingly follow. And in asking that question, we offered people initially an open-ended response, and we collected over 100 different characteristics and qualities. We pared that down to 20 key categories with some synonyms, and those key words were handed out to people in a sheet that looked something like this with some synonyms accompanying them. And we asked people to select 7 that they most admired and looked for in a leader they would willingly follow, with the key word being willingly. We gathered those responses, and we noticed that when people replied, there were a few over time the people continuously checked among the 20, the 7, selecting again 7 of the 20, a few, 4 in fact, got 51% or more of the votes continuously over the now 35 years since we have been gathering this information. And the results look something like this. Regardless of the time we've gathered them, these percentages have stayed relatively the same, particularly those that make the top of the list. And I've highlighted those 4 that get 51% or more of the votes in yellow on this slide. And you'll notice that honest, 84%, appears at the top, followed by competent, and inspiring at 66% each, and then followed by forward-looking, which is the fourth of the characteristics that people selected 51% or more of the time. And so what do we make from all this? Well, if you look at three of these characteristics, honest, competent, and inspiring, next to what researchers call source credibility, trustworthiness, expertise, and dynamism, you'll notice that they sound kind of similar. For honest, you could say trustworthiness. For competent, you could say expertise. And for inspiring, you could say that person has dynamism or is a dynamic individual. Now, there's one, the fourth one, forward-looking, which I'll say something more about later. But those three, honest, competent, forward-looking, have been in the top four consistently over the now going into 4 decades that we've been doing this research. And there's got to be a message there. People have to be telling us something. And this is not just in the United States. This is globally. And what we concluded is that of all the things that people look for, credibility is the foundation of leadership. If you don't believe in the messenger, you won't believe the message. Again, to repeat, if you don't believe in the messenger, you won't believe the message that the messenger is sending. And again, this is a global phenomenon, and what we find is that when people are high, managers in this particular case, in the research that we did, were high on credibility, people will say they're proud to tell others they're part of the organization. They'll talk up the organization with friends. They'll see their own values as similar, and they'll feel a sense of ownership. But if people rate their manager as low on credibility, then they'll produce only when watched, are motivated primarily by money. This can get very expensive. And they will say good things about the organization at work, but they'll feel differently in private. And they would consider looking for another job, particularly in tough times. Now, I would think that most of us, like most of our respondents, want an organization where a manager has high credibility and people are proud to talk about the organization with others. They'll talk it up with their friends. They see that their values and the organization's values are aligned, and they feel a sense of ownership for the place that they work, as opposed to producing only when people look over them closely, when they're motivated primarily by money, or when they say good things about the organization, but when they're talking with friends at a party or at work or online, they're saying something very different, and they would consider looking for another job in difficult times. Credibility, then, is the foundation of leadership, and people will not believe in the messenger will not believe the message that the messenger sends if they do not believe in the messenger, him or herself. So ask yourself this question and answer this question. Why should anyone want to follow you? Now, that's a very challenging and difficult question, but it is necessary if we're going to develop ourselves as leaders, or if we're coaching or developing leaders. Why should anyone want to follow me? What gives me expertise? What makes me trustworthy? Do people consider me to be dynamic and energetic and enthusiastic about our values and our vision? And don't take it for granted. Continuously ask ourselves this question as we have new people on our teams, as we work with new organizations and new colleagues. We always have to ask ourselves, why should this person want to follow me? Now, the second truth is best illustrated perhaps by this sign. Imagine yourself driving down the road and you come to a bank of fog and a sign like this. What do you do? As often happens here in California on the Pacific Coast, we encounter this kind of fog, and you, like I, will probably slow down. You'll maybe grip the steering wheel a little tight and lean in so that you can maybe see a little bit farther in the distance. You'll turn on your lights. You'll turn off any extraneous music and put that mobile phone down, of course. And then let's say that you drive a few miles very slowly and all tensed up and worried and nervous, and then the sun is shining. What do? Well, you probably, let go of the steering wheel so tightly. You lean back, you speed up, those windshield wipers go off, the lights go off, and you're driving, cruising away down the road. Well, that's what leaders need to do with their constituents. That's why leaders need to be forward-looking. They need to focus on the future. Focusing on the future sets leaders apart. It is that quality which distinguishes leaders from other credible people. Remember, I mentioned that there were three of the four qualities were things that people looked for in a credible person: honest trustworthiness, competent expertise, or dynamic and inspiring. But the fourth one that people consistently look for and have looked for 4 decades now is being forward-looking. That is the quality which differentiates leaders from other credible people, team members, colleagues, co-workers at work. What we found in our research when we asked people, what do you look for in a team member, somebody you would want to work with, forward-looking was not on the list of what people most expected from someone who was a team member or a colleague. It was on the list of what was expected of leaders. And so focusing on the future sets leaders apart. And when leaders consider themselves forward-looking, when people look for leaders, 62% look for them to be forward-looking, but in colleagues it's only 27%. That is the biggest gap in what people look for in a leader and what people look for in a colleague. And when leaders are talking about how the long-term interests of the organization can be realized by others listening in a common vision, as you'll see, the percentage of people, direct reports in this instance, who agree that those leaders are making a difference and that they personally are making a difference goes from 6% to 90%. 6% when leaders almost never or rarely show others that their long-term interests can be realized by enlisting in a common vision, up to 90% when leaders very frequently and almost always show others that their long-term interests can be realized by enlisting in a common vision. So what's important to understand here is that is the frequency with which we engage in these kinds of behaviors, such as showing others how their long-term interests can be realized by enlisting in a common vision, that are important behaviors for leaders in organizations. And when we engage in those behaviors more frequently, people are more likely to feel like they're making a difference, that the leader is effective, that they're willing to stick around in the organization, stay committed, that they're proud to tell other people that they are part of that organization, etc. Yet, inspiring a shared vision is not an annual speech. It's a daily discussion, said Louise Baxter, who is CEO of Starlight Children's Foundation in Australia. As she pointed out, leadership is not just about standing at a podium and delivering annually an important message. It is a daily conversation. And this is illustrated in some research that John Carter at Harvard University did when he's looking at a particular client organization, looked at the typical communication to an employee over a 3-month period and found that there were 2,300,000 words or numbers that were communicated, but the typical communication from leaders about vision was only 13,400 words or numbers. That's only 0.58% of the communication market share. Leaders do not frequently enough talk about those long-term interests, talk about the vision of the organization, talk about where we're headed, talk about what's out there in the future for us. So we have to increase, as Louise Baxter said, the daily discussions and the daily conversations we have about vision. And Ward Clapham describes this well when he said, I was the chief dot connector. At the end of the day, I had to connect the dots from vision and strategy to the front line. Ward, who was the commander of the Richmond Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, talked about how he, as the leader, as the commander of that organization, needed to make sure that people on the front line understood what the vision of the organization was, and he needed to connect those dots on a daily basis. I love that phrase, chief dot connector. As leader, we are the chief dot connectors in our organization. So here's a way to apply this notion. Imagine it's 10 years from now, and you're attending a ceremony honoring you as Leader of the Year. What do you hope others are saying about you that night? What do you hope others are saying about the lessons that they learned from you, the ideals that you stood for, the feelings that they had when around you, and the evidence, the tangible evidence that you made a difference, that you mattered. What do you hope people are saying that evening? You can also do this with your team. You can just substitute leader of the year for team of the year and ask yourself the same set of questions. What will people be saying about us as a team? What were they saying about the lessons they learned from us, the ideals we stood for, the feelings they had when they were around us, and the evidence that we mattered and made a difference? And if you're a leader developer, you can use this with your clients, and you can use this with yourself, imagine your coach of the year. What do you hope people are saying about you when they're celebrating you 5, 10 years from now and the impact that you had? We call this the life exercise, LIFE. L stands for lessons, I for ideals, F for feelings, E for evidence, those expressions of your leadership. And the legacy that you leave is the life that you lead, the lessons, ideals, feelings, and evidence that you lead on a daily basis that people will be talking about 10 years from now. What do you want those to be? So, Sarah, people may have some questions at this point in the talk. We're going to stop now, and in a few more minutes, we'll stop again to take some additional questions. But what questions do we have?
Great. Thanks, Jim. We have a few questions here. So regarding what people look for in a leader, do the results vary depending on level of expertise, gender, nationality, or any other criteria that you've found?
To some extent, they do. However, I must emphasize that globally, the top 4 have been the top 4 consistently over the entire time we've been collecting this data, globally and by generation. So it's not that people don't look for the same things, but the percentages may vary. What's on top in one country may not be on top. Forward-looking may be more important in some places than another. In particular, that's true for young people with forward-looking. When we do our research with students, for example, we find that among students, they only select forward-looking about 50% of the time, 45 to 50% of the time. As when I'm talking about this data, when I'm speaking to an audience of students or I'm speaking to a workplace audience, I'll often say that for students, long-term forward-looking is the weekend. We look forward to the weekend. And that's not too far from the truth. Younger respondents tend to have a shorter time horizon than those who are older. However, when they get to work and are in the workplace for about a decade, that changes, and the forward-looking becomes much more salient to them. And so it does vary depending on some demographics. It doesn't vary male-female, but it does vary by age, and it also doesn't vary around the globe in terms of the top 4. Do you have a next question?
Great, thanks, Jim. And another question we have here, what are some examples of how leaders can develop their credibility?
Well, the most important ingredient in the list of the 3 that comprise credibility is trustworthiness. And in fact, in some recent research I was reading from Jack Zenger of the qualities that people look for in a leader that build trust, the most important of those is the quality of the relationship that people have. And so trustworthiness is at the top, and we come to trust leaders when they we can have a good relationship with them. And one way you might think about this question is, do you trust people more whom you know or don't know? While we may know some individuals in very senior positions, we may not consider them trustworthy, but if we know them better, we might consider them more trustworthy. And so building a relationship and getting to know people more intimately, going back to the truth about credibility as the foundation, when people know us well, who we are, what we care about, and why they ought to be following us, when they know us at a deeper level, they're much more likely to want to consider us trustworthy and to consider us credible. So that's the first step, is really getting to know people. You get to know them, they get to know you. Do we have another question?
That's it for now. Thanks, Jim.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, let's move on to the next slide and the next truth. The third truth perhaps can be thought about in terms of this particular question. We asked people in our research to think about a time when they were at their personal best as a leader, a time when they did their Olympic gold medal winning performance. When were you at your personal best? This is the actual question that we asked people. When were you at your personal best as a leader? Tell us about that time. That we asked when we initially started our research and built our model that formed the foundation of the 5 practices of exemplary leadership and formed the foundation of our first book, The Leadership Challenge. We've been asking this question consistently ever since as we continue to update our research, and we find something very intriguing. When people think about their personal best leadership experiences, they have a response like Catherine Winkle. The similarity, when people look across the cases that people report about their personal best leadership experiences, she said that the similarity that most struck her was how each person had to overcome uncertainty and fear in order to achieve his or her personal best. Every single case is about something difficult or challenging where people face adversity, whether it's starting up a new enterprise, whether it's developing a new product, whether it was turning around a losing operation, whether it was dealing with some conflicts in the community. Regardless of the context in which people led, the stories were always about challenge, difficulty, uncertainty, which led us to this truth. Challenge is the crucible of greatness. No one ever told us that they did their personal best when keeping everything exactly the way it was. No one. It was always about something difficult, challenging, adverse, doing it for the first time, something no one had ever done before. And so, if you look at what Ginny Rometty, Chair, President, and CEO of IBM, said, think of when did you ever learn the most in your life? What experience? I guarantee you'll tell me it was a time you felt at risk. And that's how people feel when they're challenged. They're at risk. They may make mistakes. They may have to really push themselves to overcome the barriers that people have, the resistance people have to change. They may feel at risk. Their careers may be at risk. Their lives may be at risk. Their businesses may be at risk. But yet, those are the times people write about when they talk about their personal best leadership experiences. And you don't have to be Ginny Rometty to feel that way. You can be like Irving Swifty Lazar, who is a Hollywood talent scout, and I just love this comment from him. He said, when I wake up in the morning and nothing's doing, I make something happen by lunch. You know, when you wake up in the morning and it gets to lunchtime and nothing's happened, nothing's doing, delay lunch. Stick around until you actually make something happen. I mean, that's the leadership attitude of continuously wanting to innovate and improve and change the way things are, do something different, do something that challenges other people to try out new ways and innovative ways of doing their work. And when you do that as a leader, when leaders do that with us, the percentage of direct reports willing to work hard goes from almost never at 5% to 94% very frequently and almost always. Again, it's the frequency with which we engage in these behaviors as leaders that want other people to put forth their best efforts. And applying this to your own context, whether as a leader or as a developer of other leaders, at least once a week, ask yourself or ask your clients, what have I done in this week to improve so that I'm a better leader than I was a week ago? And you can also ask your team members in a team meeting the same question. Imagine going back and listening to this webinar and going back to your team in a team meeting and saying, you know, I'd like to ask each and every one of you before we end this meeting, what have you done in the last week to improve so that you're better than you were a week ago? Now, the first time you do that, you're probably going to get puzzled looks, and people are going to be very skeptical and say to themselves quietly, oh, she's been to a seminar, he's been on a webinar. But try it again a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time. And by the time you get to the fourth, they may look at you and say, and then what have you done in the last week to improve? So you're better this week than you were a week ago. That's when you know people have got the message. So this third truth is about challenging yourself and challenging other people to continuously improve and do better at what they do as leaders and as contributors. The person that I think really exemplifies this fourth truth, this gentleman in the middle, his name is Don Bennett. Don has one crutch in his left arm, and he's the person who organized this team of amputee soccer players, Lobos de Jalisco. Don is the first amputee to ever climb Mount Rainier, 14,410 feet on one leg and two crutches. And when I asked Don what the most important lesson was that he learned when climbing that mountain, being the first amputee to do so, he said, you can't do it alone. You can't do it alone. If it weren't for my wife and 7 kids, he said, I wouldn't have been able to live, let alone make it to the top of that mountain. And if it weren't for my team, I wouldn't have been able to make it to the top. And he came back down off that mountain and he asked himself, what can I do now that I feel like I'm in the best shape I've ever been in my life? What can I do now to utilize the lessons that I've learned and the energy and strength that I have? And it was one day he was out kicking the ball, or he was out with his sons in the driveway of their home, and they were playing basketball, and the ball dribbled down to him, and he kind of kicked the ball back to his kids, and he said a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, now I know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And he got on the phone and he called up a few friends and he said, I'd like you to join me in the park in Seattle because we're going to go out and we're going to play amputee soccer. And the rule's going to be, if you're going to play, you can only have one leg unless you're the goalie, and you can only have one arm. And he went out and organized the Amputee Soccer League, and he has been campaigning to make it an Olympic sport ever since that day he climbed down off that mountain. You can't do it alone. It takes a team in order to make extraordinary things happen. No leader ever got anything extraordinary done by him or herself. As Cora Carmody put it to us, she's the senior vice president of Jacob Engineering. When we interviewed her, she said it's all about fostering collaboration and building spirited teams, actively involving others, creating an environment of mutual trust and respect. Mutual trust and respect are critical to personal credibility, and they are critical to teamwork and trust and making extraordinary things happen. And as a reminder about the importance of this, Ron Carucci, who's a managing partner of consulting for Navalent, did some research on cross-functional collaboration and rivalry and found that when cross-functional rivalry or unhealthy conflict is left unaddressed, an organization is 5.82 times more likely to have people withhold or distort truthful information. When people feel a sense of high competition, of rivalry, like we want to beat that other group, unhealthy conflict, and it's left unaddressed, can lead to people distorting the truth and losing personal credibility, the team losing credibility, or withholding important information that may, in fact, help everyone solve a critical problem. Collaboration and trust are absolutely essential to making extraordinary things happen. And it's an underlying principle not only around personal credibility, but around teamwork, around on encouraging others as a leader, around setting a good example, and even inspiring a shared vision. It's important that people believe in you so that they can believe the message about the future that you're sending. It's an underlying principle in all of the practices of leadership. And just to illustrate, you can see that as leaders develop cooperative relationships among the people that he or she works with, when they do it almost never to very frequently and almost always, the percent of direct reports who agree that their leaders are effective goes from 15% to 96%. 15% when they almost never or rarely develop cooperative relationships to 96% when they very frequently or almost always develop cooperative relationships. Again, we have to more frequently engage in the behaviors that make people trust each other and work more collaboratively. And we can build or destroy it with a single word or two. In some research that people did on what's called source credibility in the literature, source credibility being the believability of a message. When people looked at the believability of the source of a message, they obviously want to know whether or not somebody is creating a sense of community and getting people to work collaboratively together. So these researchers wanted to look at this question of trust within a group. And they looked at, they used as a basis for this something called the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is often used in research when looking at essentially win-lose, lose-lose, win, lose-win kinds of situations, often called zero-sum games. And they want to look at how well people negotiate, how well people handle themselves when they're put into this kind of a situation, whether their moves are cooperative or competitive. These researchers use this game to test something. If we just simply change the name of the game, and instead of calling it the prisoner's dilemma, call it the community game, or with another group of subjects, call it the Wall Street game, will we get different results? So they got two groups of people, assigned them randomly to these groups, and told them one group to play the community game and one group to play the Wall Street game. Now, the rules of the game were exactly the same. The only difference was the name of the game. When they looked at trust moves, they found that among those who played the community game, 70% of the moves were trust moves, whereas with the Wall Street game, only 30%. And after the first move, if it was a competitive move, none of the moves were cooperative when they called it the Wall Street game. If you want to build trust and you want to build collaboration in a group, you have to be aware of what you call it. If we want a community game and want people to make trust moves, we need to make sure that we call it the community game. On the other hand, if you want people to compete, sometimes in unhealthy competition, you can call it the Wall Street game. It is important that we make sure that we call something, if we want to build trust and we want to build collaboration, by the community game and not the Wall Street game. And you also have to make sure that you build the expertise of a team in order for people to work well together. As Don said, I wouldn't have made it to the top of the mountain without my teammates. And it was their skills and abilities and their sense of support, and I have your back, literally, in the case of Don. So you have to ask, like Celia Hodgson asked as CEO of the School of Social Entrepreneurs in Australia, okay, what do you need from me so that you can completely rock at what you're doing? And here Celia turns it upside down. Instead of saying, here's what I need from you for us to completely rock, she said, what do you need from me so that you can completely rock at what you're doing? So here's a way you can implement an action around this principle, this truth of you can't do it alone. Before every interaction with every person, ask yourself this question. What can I do in this moment that I'm going to have interacting with this person, whether that moment is a minute, whether that moment is an hour, to make others, that other person or other people, feel more powerful, competent, and able to do more than they think they can? What can I do in this moment to make others feel more powerful, competent, and able to do more than they think they can? Imagine if everyone in an organization, before they had an interaction with anyone else, asked, what can I do to make these other people feel more powerful, more competent, and more able to do even than they thought they could? Imagine how high performing an organization that would be when that was everyone's focus. So ask yourself that question. And speaking of questions, what other questions do we have, Sarah?
Thanks, Jim. We do have a couple more questions. So one of them is that you say that challenge is the crucible of greatness. If things are going well for a team or company, do you suggest that leaders create challenges to avoid becoming complacent?
Yes, I do. In fact, we often say to leaders, the question you need to be asking yourself every day is, what have I changed lately? That's the job of leaders. Keeping things the same is not the job of leaders. Focusing on continuous improvement and doing things better is the job of leaders. So yes, even when things are calm and running well, as a leader, you need to be asking yourself, what can we do differently? What can we do better? How can we continuously improve? It goes back to that question we mentioned earlier about what have I done in the last week to improve so I'm better this week than it was a week ago. It doesn't have to be a big change. It could be a micro change. But it needs to be some focus. Again, the attention needs to be on innovative ways we can improve. As the data shows, the more frequently leaders do that, the higher the level of engagement among the people that work with that leader. Do you have another question?
I do. Thanks, Jim. You say that cross-functional rivalry or conflict can lead to bad things, but some companies seem to encourage that and still do well. Why do you think that is?
They will do well for a time, but if you look at the research over the long term, cooperation outperforms competition and individualistic achievement. Cooperation outperforms competition and individualistic achievement over time. And so while in the short run, promoting competition internally may produce positive outcomes, but if conflicts developed and those conflicts aren't resolved, if rivalry develops, if people see themselves not as trying to be their best, but rather beat somebody else, then it will become unhealthy rivalry and people will be less productive and lower performers. The data is pretty clear on that. So yes, we may find that in the short term we need to increase the energy with which people engage in behaviors that make them higher performers, but we need to avoid making people see that that means competing with the person sitting next to them. It means working cooperatively with them, but with a higher level of energy, because beating somebody else is not the same thing as being your best. Do we have another question, or shall we move on to the next truth?
Thanks, Jim. I think we'll hold on to the rest of the questions for the end so you can get through your slides.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sarah. And
thank you.
The next fifth truth is answered by this question we most frequently get asked. The question that Barry and I have been asked most frequently, and I was asked this just 2 days ago in a seminar that I was doing. What is the question about leadership that we are asked most frequently? And people said, are leaders born or made? That is correct. That is the one we get asked most frequently. Are leaders born or made? So Barry and I, having been asked this very frequently over the last now 4 decades of working together, have done the research, and we have an empirical answer to this question. We have a scientifically investigated answer. That is that we have never met a leader who was not born. No, all of us are born. All accountants are born. All engineers are born. All architects are born. All athletes are born. Every one of us is born. That's not the question. The question really should be, what do we do with what we have before we die? What do we do with the talents, skills, and abilities that we have to become better than we currently are? How do we matter? How do we make a difference? How can I use my talents and abilities? If I'm in a leadership role, how can I be a better leader tomorrow than I am today? What we have found in our research is that the best leaders are the best learners. Those leaders who engage more frequently in learning activities make better leaders. Now, this should be no surprise to anyone And yet, Jack Zenger, a colleague of ours, did some research in organizations looking at when people got their first leadership development experience. It was, on average, the age was 42 years old, which was 10 years after they started supervising other people. Now, in what other area of life would we want somebody to be practicing their craft for 10 years and not get any training in it? As inexcusable. We wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want an accountant for whom that was true. We wouldn't want a physician for whom that was true. We wouldn't want to work with even a team member next to us that had no training in the skill area that they were working in for 10 years working there for 10 years before they got any formal training. That's what we do with leaders. So it's no surprise that we find that the best leaders are the best learners. Those who choose to participate in learning and development on an ongoing basis make better leaders. This was reinforced. Josh Bersin just came out with a report on some research that he had done through his company and found that, in fact, it is absolutely true that when people engage more frequently in learning at work, they are more engaged at work. And so we have to understand that people have the capacity to grow and develop as leaders. The percentage of people in our research who have no leadership abilities whatsoever is 0.00013%. That would be, if we had real people around, that would take 1 million people to find one person with no leadership ability. 1 in 1 million. Now, you may say, I know that 1 in 1 million. I've worked for that person who's the 1 in 1 million. Maybe true, but for the vast majority of us, we do have the capacity to learn and grow and develop as leaders. 99.99987% of people demonstrate at least some capability to lead, and to get to become the most exemplary leader you can be, you have to engage in more learning activities and engage more frequently in the exemplary practices that will make you the best you can be. Barry Posner and our colleague Lillis Brown did a study together in which they looked at this very practice of learning more frequently and found that better learners consistently engaged in leadership practices more frequently than those in the low learning category. So learning translates into better leading. It makes us better leaders. As K. Anders Ericsson put it, living in a cave doesn't make you a geologist. Ericsson and colleagues wrote a paper in The Making of an Expert and talking about their collective research on what makes people have the greatest expertise in their field, and made this very cogent observation. Just being there doesn't make one good at what they do. Just being in a leadership role and having a title doesn't make one a better leader. It takes practice. It takes deliberate practice in order to become the best you can be. As Dick Rockwell, as a baseball coach to a colleague of ours, Don Schulk, put it, practice begins at 3 and ends at 5. If that's all you do, we won't win and you won't play. In other words, just showing up for the couple of hours of formal practice doesn't make for a team that has a winning record, and doesn't make for an individual who's going to play for very much. You have to practice, and you have to go beyond the formal routine in order to become the best you can be. Jim Whitaker, another colleague with whom we had the awesome experience of working together. Jim was the first American to ascend Mount Everest. He's also sailed a couple of times around the world, and in between founded a company, REI. It's about making the most of every moment, he said, about stretching your own boundaries, about being willing to learn constantly and putting yourself in situations where learning is possible. He said that in response to a question of why do you do what you do? Why do you do all of these challenging things? And for him, it was about stretching his boundaries, about learning constantly and putting himself in situations where learning was possible. And I think that's what all of us need to do to become the best leaders we can be. At the end of each day, just record your answer to this question. Did I do my best today to learn and grow as a leader? How would you answer that question? Did you do your best today? And how about tomorrow and the next day and the next day? Like Jim, find situations that make learning possible so that you can become the best leader that you can be. Now, I'll have a few closing comments, and I would like to share with you, if you'll stay tuned for just a little while longer, the secret to success in life. But before we do that, let's take a few more questions, Sarah, and then we'll close this out.
Thank you, Jim. So one of the questions we got was, how do you connect these these 5 truths, to your 5 exemplary leadership practices?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. The 5 practices, for those who aren't familiar with our work on the Leadership Challenge, are model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge the process, enable others to act, and encourage the heart. And so you can probably see in the presentation I gave on truth that some of these appear. The principles are those kind of the underlying, the current that flows beneath them, or the foundational principles that show up in more than one of the practices. For example, as I mentioned earlier, trust and trustworthiness shows up around enable others to act. It shows up around model the way when you're talking about your values. It shows up in inspire a shared vision when you're talking about the future. People have to believe in the messenger if they're going to believe the message. That's something that's truth that kind of runs through all of these. It's sort of woven, it's threads that are woven through the fabric of the 5 practices. So it's just coincidental that I talked about 5 truths. There are actually 10 truths in our book, The Truth About Leadership. People can actually look at some videos on EBSCO's XL5, in which they can hear more about some of this information and other of our truths, but that's sort of the connection between the 2.
Thanks, Jim. And finally, what advice do you have for leaders on ways to become better learners?
Going back to the question, for example, I mentioned earlier about what have I done this week to improve so that I'm a better leader than I was a week ago. It's building up a routine for yourself where you set aside time to reflect, time to learn something new, time to challenge yourself. It might be that, going back to the research on learning that Barry Posner and Willis Brown conducted, it's not your learning style, but rather the frequency with which you engage in learning. So you might be a reader and you might like to read. It's one of my favorite ways of learning new stuff. And so set aside some time every day to read. It might be talking to other people and asking them, so you were involved in a project like the one I'm about to embark on. Give me some tips. What did you learn? It might be having somebody sit in a meeting that you're conducting and give you some feedback about how that meeting went. It might be asking somebody to observe you giving a speech and giving you some feedback on it. Maybe this is somebody who is in your HR department or who is a coach from the outside on presentation skills. Find ways in which you can integrate, as Josh Burson talks about it, on making learning part of the flow of the work. So in your daily routine, there must be times when you can get some feedback on how well you conducted a meeting or gave a speech. There must be some times when you can talk to other people about things that they've learned. There must be some times you can set aside for reading or just trying out new stuff and seeing how it works. But it really means you have to be conscientious and you have to pay attention to it and you have to make it part of your daily routine. You have to make learning a habit. Do we have another question?
Sorry, Jim. We have a few more, but we can get back to them at the end of this session. We can probably just continue on with the slides for time purposes.
Perfect. Okay, Sarah, thanks so much. So let me just continue and thank you all very much for being with us today. Really appreciate the time that you've spent. And if you'd like to explore these topics a little bit further, there are some videos as well as book summaries, articles, and ebooks available through EBSCO on their SL5 platform. Accelerate your learning in 5 minutes or less on EBSCO's site, and invite you to explore that. And also like to share with you in closing the website address, sl-5.com. And one last learning, probably the most important lesson I have learned in all of the work that we've done, and only one story that has survived all 6 editions, that's been included in all 6 editions, from the very first edition of the Leadership Challenge to the 6th edition. It's a story that I love to tell when I was interviewing Major General John Stanford. John was a Major General in the United States Army at the time, head of MITMIC, Military Traffic Management Command for the United States. And when he retired from the Army, he became the county administrator for Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is located, and then he went on to be superintendent of schools in the Seattle Unified School District. And at the end of the interview with John, as we ask at the end of all the interviews that we do, we say, we ask John, how do we develop leaders for the future? What advice would you give us, given your experience of developing leaders for the future? And John said, when anyone asks me that question, I tell them I have the secret to success in life. The secret to success is to stay in love. Staying in love gives you the fire to really ignite other people, to see inside other people, to have a greater desire to get things done than other people. A person who is not in love doesn't really feel the kind of excitement that helps them to get ahead and lead others and to achieve. I don't know any other fire, any other thing in life that is more exhilarating and is more positive a feeling than love is. Now, I did not expect to hear that response, particularly from a Major General in the United States Army. But I think that lesson of love them and lead them, stay in love, is a lesson that all of us can take away from this webinar and our own personal experience. When we love what we do, when we love the people we're doing it with, we love the people who bless us with purchasing our goods and services or engaging with us in the work that we do together, we can make extraordinary things happen on a daily basis. So love them and lead them, and thank you all very much for this opportunity to be with you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for everyone who attended our session today. You will receive an email from us within the next few days with a link to the recording, along with any additional information should you have further questions or comments. Thank you again, and have a great day.